Welcome to Fillfactor. So what exactly is Fillfactor? Well, in a nutshell, Fillfactor tells the SQL Server how much free space to leave on each data page when building a new index or when rebuilding or reorging an index. We use the Fillfactor setting to help reduce fragmentation of our indexes as the indexes are used over time. Now, setting a Fillfactor setting of a setting other than 0, which is the default, is going to increase the size of your database, but it's also going to increase the performance of the database as well, because insert, update, and delete statements are not going to have to page split the index every single time they want to make a change to the system. So the Fillfactor setting is always going to be used when rebuilding your indexes. It is not maintained, however, through your normal insert, update, and delete operations. So when a page is full and a normal insert operation needs to happen, it's not going to maintain that Fillfactor, so it's not going to leave that white space. That white space is only left around when you actually do an index rebuild or defrag operation. It's very normal for every index on your system to have a different Fillfactor setting. You want to set the Fillfactor setting based on the specific needs of the specific index. We can set general guidelines that say kind of numbers where you should start at when configuring Fillfactor. But there's no hard and fast rule. When setting Fillfactor, big question is always, what should it be? Well, this is really going to vary based on the data types of the index we're working with, the index update and delete usage of the table, and the defragmentation and rebuild schedule. Indexes where all the data is inserted in ascending order should really be set to 0. This includes things like the clustered index, where the clustered index is built on an identity column, or a date column where the date is auto-generated or it's always ascending. Non-clustered indexes are typically going to be set somewhere between 70 and 90%. But again, this really depends on the data type involved. If we're using something like GUIDs, or unique identifier values, we're typically going to want to drop that percentage down to about 30 to 50% because unique identifiers are so incredibly random. Now, how do we find the correct Fillfactor? Start with one of the recommended numbers, somewhere in the 70 to 90% range for a normal non-clustered index, 30 to 50% for something that's got a GUID in it. Then watch your data fragmentation between your index rebuild or reorg operations. Based on how long it takes for the index to become fragmented between rebuild operations is going to tell you how you want to adjust the index. If the index becomes heavily fragmented within a day or two, and you only rebuild your indexes once a week, then you're going to want to set a much lower Fillfactor for that index. Once you've got it set, test it, let it see how it goes, and then repeat as necessary until you find that sweet spot where the index doesn't get too fragmented, and then you can do your rebuild operations during your maintenance window. Now, there's a couple of places you can set the Fillfactor setting. There's an instance level default setting. Now, this only affects new indexes. So we want to set this if we want to make sure that all the indexes on the system are set to a specific value. Now, if you've got junior developers creating indexes, or if you've got an application vendor that doesn't specify an index Fillfactor when they're creating indexes, this is a good place to set it because it'll cover all your bases. Pick a number right around 60-70% usually, and you'll be okay most of the time. You can also set the Fillfactor on an index-by-index basis. Now, the catch is when setting it on an index-by-index basis, once you modify the Fillfactor for the index and click OK in Management Studio, that actually runs a rebuild operation immediately, which then rebuilds the index to that new Fillfactor. Let's go ahead and look at the two setting locations where we can set index Fillfactors and see how they're set. As you can see, we've got a SQL Server database engine that we're connected to through Management Studio. So let's go ahead and look at the instance level Fillfactor setting first. Now we're going to see that on the database settings page of the instance properties. We see the default index Fillfactor is set for 0, which is the default. We can simply change the setting, click OK, and any new indexes that are created on the system will use that default index Fillfactor. Indexes that are rebuilt will not. They will use their specific index Fillfactor. An existing index will never default back to the default index Fillfactor, only used for new indexes. So closing that, let's go ahead and look at an index that exists on the system and how we change its fill factor. So we just go to the properties of the index. We look at the options tab. We can see some basic settings as well as the fill factor setting. If we change the setting here, change it from 0 to say 70%, we can then click OK and that'll run a rebuild operation. We can verify what's going to happen by clicking the script button and generating the T-SQL script. Click Cancel and review the script. Now on the script here, we can see alter index, aka department name, on humanresources.department, rebuild all partitions, and as we scroll over here, we'll find the fill factor setting within the with clause over here at the end. Fill factor equals 70. If I run this statement, the index will be rebuilt and the fill factor will be changed as part of the new rebuild. There is unfortunately no way to tell SQL Server that I want to change the fill factor of an index, but I don't want to change it until the next scheduled rebuild. So in summary, the fill factor tells the SQL Server how much free space to leave in each data page. It's recommended that the fill factor is going to change from index to index. You really don't want one fill factor for all your indexes. There are companies out there that have policies that say that every index should have a specific fill factor. Those companies tend to have performance problems with their index unless they've selected a very, very small fill factor, like 10 or 15, 20%, but then they're wasting a lot of space on a lot of indexes that don't need the fill factor set that high, specifically on all their clustered indexes, which are typically based off of identity columns.